there is a darkness in humanity that has manifested itself in a lust for blood throughout the ages. The Old Testament and ancient myths catalog murder and revenge as part of the fabric of life in ancient times. Cain slew Abel. Romulus slew Remus. Unleashing the beast within is a possibility for all of us. The decision to kill from passion or premeditation has often defined our world, past, present, and future. Wars have terrorized entire populations for thousands of years. The American West was home to ruthless killers who were idolized in fiction and folklore. Evil evolved to a hideous new form with the genocidal dictators of the 20th century, such as Hitler, Stalin, and Mao Zedong, who ordered the death of tens of millions. But in the middle of the 20th century, a new and chilling phenomenon emerged in post-war Western society: the serial killer. As if fashioned from our nightmares, they terrify and fascinate us. Lurking behind masks of bland normality, they often evade capture for years, decades, or eternity. They are America's serial killers.
We killed her. We dumped her body off, and that was it. Nothing to it.
Every year in this country, we have about 20 serial killers, 10 of whom are apprehended, 10 of whom are on the loose. And they are, in total, responsible for some 200 deaths. So 200 victims of serial killers on a yearly basis. And what makes this particularly important for us is that the average serial killer is responsible for 10 deaths. That's a huge body count.
America's Serial Killers, Portraits in Evil, will strip the covers from a world of profiling and forensic science as we expose America's most brutal serial killers. By the 1980s, America had come out of the gloomy hangover from the Vietnam War. Long gas lines and the humiliation of the embassy takeover in Iran were forgotten, in the past. This was the decade of greed, the me first generation, and the dominance of Wall Street. It was also the beginning of the computer revolution and the rise of cable television, which produced the MTV generation, changing the landscape of entertainment forever. On the dark side, drugs ruled the streets, and violent crime was at an all-time high. Violent crime that now included the serial killer. Criminologists started writing books on the subject. While its causes were still a mystery, everyone had finally agreed upon a definition.
My definition of a serial killer is in 7 parts. It's a rather long definition. A shorter definition that came out of an FBI seminar a couple of years ago in San Antonio, in which we had work groups for a week in San Antonio. They finally agreed with me, basically, because I've always said it's 2 or more. Their consistent definition in the past has been 3 or more with a cooling off period in between. Now they're talking about 2 or more. They're talking about the possibility of different locations, but not always. And of course, at different times. That's really what distinguishes the serial killer.
One of the defining characteristics of serial killers, sociopathic behavior, seemed to fit the me first and only greed found on Wall Street in the 80s. A me first attitude epitomized by the character of Gordon Gekko in the hit movie Wall Street.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
Well, it's now officially referred to as antisocial personality disorder, which is kind of a mouthful. Sociopath and psychopath are used interchangeably. Probably the best definition came from Robert Hare, a Canadian, who talked about the fact that they don't have any empathy, and they don't, they're very easy for them to manipulate people. They see people as objects. They see people as ways to meet their own ends, whether they're going to kill them, whether they're going to climb beyond them to a higher step in industry. Not all sociopaths are serial killers. There's probably a number of sociopaths, or although the business community might call them type A personalities, who are, way up in corporations and got there because of their willingness to step over people and be very ruthless in how they got there. So it's, in the context of a serial killer, he doesn't care about the victims. He wants them to be easy. He wants them to be vulnerable because that adds to his thrill. He wants power over those people. He wants to be able to dominate them and control them for a period of time before he or she kills them.
While the 80s produced a common definition of serial murderers, how many serial killers were actually operating at any given time was still a hotly debated issue.
In the United States, serial killers, I'll bet there are probably, and this would be just a wild guess because obviously I have no access to the raw numbers of different pattern crimes that are going on. There have got to be a couple of hundred at least serial killers in operation right now. Whether it's somebody that's going up and down a highway as a truck driver, or if it's somebody that's killing one or two here and then not doing anything for a couple of years and then another one here and there. I would guess probably a couple of hundred serial killers in operation right now.
What the 80s and early 90s did show was that the serial killer had many faces, and one of the most bizarre is the case of Henry Lee Lucas. He was a man who could either be the most prolific serial killer of all time, or a pathetic wannabe who accidentally killed his mother.
Henry Lee Lucas is a good example of someone who wanted to be the Heisman Trophy winner of serial murder, claiming to have amassed a huge body count. At one time he said that he had killed 800 people. Another time he said it was 360.
Henry Lee Lucas was born in Blacksburg, Virginia in 1936. Raised by a sadistic and abusive mother, Henry, like a number of other serial killers, engaged in animal torture. He killed them and then sexually violated their corpses, a practice he carried into his murderous crime spree many years later. At the age of 14, Lucas claims to have killed his first victim.
If you believe his story of killing a young girl who was waiting for a school bus, and he was riding around as I think he was 14 or 15 years of age, and got in hold of a car and took this young kid up on the side of a hill and raped her, and then decided he didn't want any witnesses, so he killed her. And he told me that like he, had swatted a fly.
Following a series of petty crimes and prison terms, Lucas got into a fight with his 74-year-old mother. After stabbing her to death, he had sex with her corpse. That was in 1960. 10 years later, he was released from prison at the age of 34. He went back to prison immediately, this time for trying to kidnap 2 teenage girls. He was released for the final time in 1975.
Henry Lee Lucas was let out of jail in Jackson, Michigan. He told the prison officials that he was going to leave them on their doorstep if they let him go. There are 2 confirmed deaths attributed to Lucas in Michigan after he was released, his final release from Jackson Prison in Jackson, Michigan, which most people believe were committed by Lucas.
Soon after, Lucas met Otis Toole, a vicious homosexual psychopath. Together, they unleashed an 8-year reign of terror, roaming the country, killing and mutilating untold numbers of victims. Lucas claimed he picked up most of his prey along the interstates, offering rides and sometimes dinner or a drink. Just about everyone I pick up, I kill 'em. That's the way it always turns out. To me, a live woman ain't nothing. I enjoy dead sex more than I do live sex. Steveegger is a criminologist and former police officer who had direct contact with Lucas, interviewing him many times.
Lucas confessed to a lot. Lucas confessed to crimes he didn't commit. Lucas would confess to crimes when the officers or the investigators would use profanity. Lucas would confess to a person if he didn't like them. But the real key was don't use any cuss words. Don't use damn, don't use darn, don't use anything. And that's the best advice I got from a gentleman who was with 2020, a producer who had interviewed Lucas and told me when I went down and I was scheduled to go down and see Lucas to not use any swear words at all. And I didn't. And look him straight in the eye and shake his hand, and we went from there. So we had a relationship for a while, in which I would interview him in his cell. I would interview him downstairs, where he would come down for coffee and chain smoking Pall Mall cigarettes before he was scheduled for his interviews in the morning. I would drive over from Huntsville, Sam Houston State University, where I was a doctoral student, and get up real early and drive over there when it was still dark over the rural roads of Texas, which was fun. And we'd talk. And other times I rode with him when he escorted the Texas Rangers and other Texas law enforcement agents to the scene of his crimes in Texas, the individuals he'd killed, and in some cases the bodies that had not been found. Personally, I think Lucas probably killed, between Lucas and Toole worked with him for a while, who was a flaming transvestite arsonist, if you will. Between the two of them, they probably killed 50 to 60 people, which in my my world, that's a lot of people. He claimed first to have killed 60. When he first started confessing after he'd been arrested for a violation of parole and having a weapon. Then he confessed to killing Kate Rich, which was really his last victim, an older woman that he killed and stuffed under a house, and later took her back out of the house and burned her in a pot-belly stove. And that was confirmed. And his girlfriend, lover, daughter, if you will, which he treated different ways depending on his mood, according to him, he killed her and dropped parts of her around a field. That was his second to last killing, I believe. Or it may be vice versa, I'm not sure, because it was hard to get the sequence right. But I believe he killed 50 to 60 people.
Then, in 1983, Lucas was picked up on a weapons charge in Texas. While coming out of the DTs, he claimed to have a religious experience and began confessing to countless murders in order to receive redemption from his Maker. After a brief trial, Lucas was put on death row. For many, Lucas was the most unusual serial killer of all time, the perfect serial killer. He partnered with a gay sociopath, roamed the country looking for victims, mutilating them, cannibalizing them, and practicing necrophilia on them. For others, Lucas is the ultimate manipulator and liar. As for Toole, in April 1984, he was convicted for killing 64-year-old George Sonnenberg in Florida. Later that year, Toole was found guilty of the 1983 slaying of 19-year-old Ada Johnson and received a second death sentence. However, both sentences were commuted to life in prison. Were the bizarre claims by Lucas and Toole works of fantasy or reality? What we know for sure is that both men died of cirrhosis of the liver in prison, Toole in 1996 and Lucas in 2001. Ironically, 3 years before Lucas died, on June 26, 1998, then Texas Governor George Bush commuted his death sentence to life imprisonment. Lucas is the only death row inmate to ever receive clemency from the 43rd President of the United States. While Lucas and Toole were cruising American highways in the lower 48, another kind of depravity, another man was doing the unthinkable far to the north in America's largest state, Alaska. Alaska is the last great American frontier, a vast wilderness of tall mountains and remote forests. It embodied the mindset of Wall Street in the 1980s, that the world was a hostile place full of threats and predators. Success was ruthless domination of your enemies, followed by full enjoyment of your success without regret or remorse. It was a here and now culture of immediate gratification, a trait shared by serial killers.
Serial killers crave power and dominance and control. They want desperately to feel superior to their victims.
Part of this broader culture of immediate satisfaction was trophy hunting. Trophy hunting carried to the extreme by businessmen and by serial killer Robert Hansen. It was here in beautiful, pristine Alaska that Robert Hansen added a bizarre and depraved twist to the world of serial killers when he created the most chilling killing field in all of America. Hunting women for sport like they were animals.
One of the scariest aspects of talking about serial killers is to think that their behavior is very human. You know, you hear about like somebody's a serial killer and everybody, they're like, oh, he's an animal. What animal does that? Tell me the animal that does that. What animal goes out and kills for the joy of it? Maybe there is one, but I don't know about it. Humans do that. Only humans do that.
Hansen's MO and signature were unique among serial killers, fulfilling one of the most depraved fantasies.
But here was a man who not only desired to apprehend women and to have control of them, but desired to release them and experience their fear as he hunted them down in cold blood.
Robert Hansen was born in America's heartland, Esterville, Iowa, in 1939. He had always been an oddball sort. Taunted by classmates for his stuttering, he was filled with rage and was primed to become one of those notorious school spree killers. But in 1963, he moved to Anchorage, Alaska, and became a champion hunter and successful businessman. A manic-depressive personality, in 1980, his darker moods got the best of him. He turned his champion hunting skills against women. For 3 years, Hansen abducted prostitutes and exotic dancers and flew them in his private plane to his cabin in a ruggedly beautiful river valley 25 miles south of Anchorage. Here, he stalked and killed 21 women with a .223 caliber Ruger Mini 14 hunting rifle, often dispatching them with the long-bladed hunting knife he also carried. Thinking like a hunter, Hansen displayed in the most obvious way his sociopathic behavior by keeping trophies from his victims.
Indeed, they often collect trophies, souvenirs, mementos of the good times that they had with their victims when they were inflicting pain and suffering, and they use these souvenirs and trophies to reminisce about those good times later on.
Hansen might have played his demented game of sport killing forever, except luck and pluck smiled upon one of his prey.
He had attempted to bring a woman to his airplane to fly out, and she escaped from him and went to the police. She was able to identify the airplane. She was able to identify his home. And again, once the authorities were willing to believe him, because initially he claimed that he wasn't involved, and he got a couple of his buddies to confirm that he was with them and that he couldn't possibly have committed the crimes. And this was an upstanding citizen, a business owner, a bakery owner, a member of society. But once his buddies heard the things that he was being accused of, one of them called and said, he asked me to say that. And once they got beyond that, they were able to find the weapons associated with it, and they were able to pin him down and connect him specifically to the crimes.
In 1988, Hansen became one of the first inmates at the Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward, where he still lives, serving out his 461-year-plus life sentence. Two years later, over 2 days in August of 1990, a serial killer paralyzed Gainesville, Florida, with 5 grotesque murders. Murders of young college students. Indeed, so savage were his kills, he was dubbed the Gainesville Ripper. This was a unique twist on serial killing, as the killer morphed into a spree killer, killing in rapid fashion.
I think that there are serial killers that sex is the absolute center of what they're about. There's also people for whom there's a connection between the death of the victim and their own sexual excitement. There's obvious reasons why a serial killer would have these gaps between crimes, and certainly, the notion of being sort of sexually satisfied or psychologically satisfied for a period of time would be part of it. I think that there's a notion with some killers that over time the length of time for which they're satisfied becomes shorter and shorter, and the desire becomes greater and greater, and the amount of time between the crimes becomes shorter and shorter, simply because they want to over and over again experience this feeling.
It began on August 26th. That afternoon, college co-ed Christina Powell was supposed to meet her parents. She never made it. When police went to the apartment she shared with fellow freshman Sonia Larson, they found only the girl's mutilated corpses, posed in grotesque positions. Then, only 8 hours later, Krista Hoyt was late for her midnight shift with the Gainesville Police Department. Officers found her at home, killed with the same signature mutilation. 2 days passed when, without warning, 2 young housemates, a man and a woman, were found murdered at the home they rented. Apparently interrupted in his work, the killer did not have time to hack the bodies. By now, all Gainesville knew that a serial killer was on the loose. In one evening, this sleepy college town had gone from being one of the country's best places to live to one of its most frightening. Police were baffled at first, and they focused on the wrong man. But 11 days later, when Danny Rolling was arrested for burglary, surprisingly, he confessed to the murders. The Gainesville Ripper had been caught. Danny Rolling was born in 1954 in Shreveport, Louisiana. His father, James, a police officer, often abused him, his mother, and his brother Kevin. In 1990, Danny left Louisiana, but not before killing 3 people with the signature of mutilation that would become his trademark of killing. And when he killed again in Florida, he fit the definition of a serial killer. Allusions to serial murderer Ted Bundy were inevitable. The Washington-born killer had murdered co-eds at Florida State University in Tallahassee in 1976. But the slaughter of the Gainesville victims was more like Jack the Ripper. Like the London Ripper, death had not been enough for Danny Rolling.
Danny Rolling, who killed 5 college students at the University of Florida in 1990, would excise the nipples of his female victims and carry them off in a little plastic bag to enjoy himself with later on.
Never showing any remorse for his heinous crimes, Danny Rolling, a true sociopath, was put to death by lethal injection on October 25, 2006.
I remember speaking with a homicide detective in Florida after Danny Rolling killed 5 beautiful college students there. And he said that the death penalty wasn't good enough for Danny Rolling. He should be made to live in Stark Prison, a dungeon, for the rest of his life. He'd be begging for death.
Instead of remembering Danny Rolling and his fiendish killings, students and faculty at the University of Florida have made it a point to remember the 5 students cut down in their prime.
In Gainesville, Florida, 5 beautiful college students were brutally murdered by Danny Rolling, who was recently executed by the state of Florida. Fortunately, in the aftermath, the students at the University of Florida erected a graffiti board that contains the names of all 5 victims, and it's located in a very prominent place on campus. Every so often people come to the graffiti board, which is maintained by the school, and they place flowers at the base. That, I think, is the model. We have to focus on the victims more than we focus on the killers, but that doesn't usually happen.
If Danny Rolling wasn't the true reincarnation of Jack the Ripper, then Robert Lee Yates was. Known as the Spokane Prostitute Killer, Yates would bring the sadistic malevolence of serial murder full circle from its beginnings over a century ago. 110 years after Jack the Ripper slashed through London's East End, killing and mutilating prostitutes, Yates raped, shot, and killed 13 prostitutes in Spokane, Washington, with the same ghoulish zeal. Yet, in 100 years, a great difference emerged in this circle of death. While all of London had risen up in horror at the killing of prostitutes, Spokane didn't seem to care all that much.
The best commonality that I can come up with for a serial killer is that he or she, in most cases, will attack a vulnerable victim. They don't want to tussle with the victim. It's easy. They don't want to have the hassle on the street, pick up a prostitute. Nobody's going to pay any attention to that, particularly if it's an area, a red light district, or a place where prostitutes walk and ply their trade. They drive off never to be seen again. Who's going to miss them? Maybe other prostitutes. Like in the Robert Yates case up in Spokane, a prostitute reported a woman, another prostitute, missing, and indicated that she had last been seen getting into a white Corvette. Police took no notice of it. They totally ignored it. Later on, when they finally arrested Robert Yates and a few more victims, they found out that he did own a white Corvette and had killed the girl in question.
Yates, born in 1952, grew up in western Washington on Whidbey Island in Puget Sound, just north of Seattle. In 1975, he briefly became a prison guard at the state penitentiary in Walla Walla before joining the Army and becoming a helicopter pilot. Returning home to Spokane, he seemed like any ordinary war hero. But on August 25, 1996, this hero fell over the edge into the abyss of murder and began his new role as a serial killer of prostitutes.
Robert Yates would pick up his victims, most of them prostitutes, and before he killed them, after he raped them, he would put a plastic bag, in most cases a black plastic bag, over their head and then shoot them in the face. Apparently the idea was he didn't want to get any blood on him when he shot the victims. Or he didn't want to see the victim's face when they died. I mean, it's, there's a whole range of explanations for that. But he actually killed young girls the same age as his daughters. He buried a couple under his bedroom window on his own property for some reason. The others were found strewn across the wilds outside of Spokane.
The reasons for Yates' butchering of women are as unknown as Jack the Ripper's reasons for slaughtering in London.
There was a man by the name of Robert Lifton who wrote a book called Doubling, and he wrote about the doctors in the Nazi war camps and the terrible things they did to Jews and Christians and gypsies and mentally ill people and people who were deformed in some form or fashion without any anesthetic. And he talked about the fact that they could conduct these experiments with no anesthetic, obviously, either killing these people or, severe bodily harm and putting terror in their minds and a lot of pain. And then go home at night, sit down at the table, and have a happy meal with their families. Now, he called that doubling. In other words, it's a double person. You're one person here and you're one person there. In some cases, I think that's what somebody like Yates did. I think it's what somebody like Bundy did. It's also been referred to as compartmentalizing a part of your life. In other words, it's over there, and when I want it, I take it, and I go kill someone, but the rest of the time, I'm just like everyone else.
Ironically, in 2008, Yates is now on death row at Walla Walla, the same prison he used to work at as a guard. If Robert Lee Yates embodied Jack the Ripper's loathing for prostitutes, hands-on killing, and mutilation of the victims, the Unabomber took serial killing at a distance to new heights, terrifying the whole nation. Just as Son of Sam terrorized New York and the Zodiac Killer San Francisco. Indeed, for nearly 2 decades, the Unabomber terrorized the United States of America. Any letter could contain a bomb. His M.O. trademark of death. Any letter could explode in a person's hands, maiming, at the very least, more likely, killing. This serial killer was Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber, and he would go down in the history of serial murder as the ultimate distance killer. Kaczynski was born in Chicago, and by everybody's standards, he was a brilliant student, excelling in math. It looked from the outside as though he had a storybook life. Graduating high school early, he went to Harvard at age 16. Graduate school at 20, and became an assistant professor of mathematics at the University of California, Berkeley by age 25. But beneath this storied exterior beat the heart of an outcast. At an early age, he preferred to play alone, and his mother even worried he suffered from autism. Years later at Harvard, he unwittingly participated in a covert CIA mind control and chemical interrogation research program dubbed MK Ultra. Some believe that the project left him unbalanced and caused Kaczynski to become the Unabomber.
There are crimes of mental illness. The sorts of people who have manifestations or symptoms of schizophrenia. There's a lot of speculation that Ted Kaczynski suffered from schizophrenia, and that there's a link between his mental illness and his activities as the Unabomber.
Whatever happened to the young man, Kaczynski's storybook life collapsed in 1969. He quit Berkeley and 2 years later went to live in a remote cabin in Montana. It was from here he began his letter campaign of death in 1978. The bombs looked like ordinary packages that anyone might receive. The first was sent in May 1978 as a, quote, return package to engineering professor Buckley Christ at Northwestern University. Christ, suspicious that the handwriting on the return was not his own, called campus security. When Officer Terry Marker opened the package, it exploded, injuring his left hand severely. In all, 16 bombs were sent, injuring 23 people and killing 3. Some believe Kaczynski gained no psychological satisfaction from his killings, that he was just a misguided idealist. But Dr. Jack Levin has a different take on this ultimate distance killer.
Ted Kaczynski is clearly a serial killer. He killed several people, attempted to kill more than that by sending letter bombs through the mail to the leaders of the airlines and academia. He stayed on the loose for 17 years. People say that Kaczynski was a misguided man who really only wanted to save us from ourselves. You know, he was sort of a high-tech Robin Hood. And he was going to save us from our high-tech industrial or post-industrial society. Well, I don't buy it. I think he loved killing, and he had an IQ that permitted him to write a 33,000-word manifesto that was published in the Washington Post under the threat of more killing by Kaczynski. I think if some of the other serial killers, like Albert DeSalvo or Danny Rowling or Richard Ramirez, if any of them had the intelligence that Kaczynski had, they too would have supplied a 33,000-word rationalization for their crimes. Kaczynski had the IQ, he had the opportunity, he was holed up in a cabin in Montana for 2 decades, and he wrote a manifesto that, in my view, was just nothing more or less than a well-crafted justification for his killing spree. He loved to kill. He could never admit that to anyone else, but that, I think, is the bottom line here.
The FBI pulled out all the stops to find the Unabomber. Before he was identified and captured, the name came from the FBI's shorthand designation of the case as Unabomber, standing for University and Airline Bomber. The press picked it up and began using Unabomber when referring to the letter serial killer. The Unabomber was finally caught after the Washington Post published his 33,000-word rambling manifesto against technology. The style of writing was recognized by Kaczynski's brother, who tipped off the FBI. The ultimate coward in serial killing, the Unabomber was arrested on April 3, 1996, and is now serving a life sentence at the federal Supermax prison facility in Florence, Colorado. The 80s and giddy times of the 90s were now over. However, the many facets of serial killing that arose during this 20 years of slaughter only added to criminologists and psychologists' failure to understand the serial killer. Serial killing continued at an ever-increasing rate. Continued as crime investigation techniques improved and forensics had become a full-fledged science. But ironically, the many books, movies, and television shows devoted to serial killing had educated the real serial killers. They were adapting and getting smarter.
We're dealing with the worst kinds of criminals that you can think of. This is the greatest challenge to law enforcement, and we have to always keep that in mind. We're talking about the cream of the crop when it comes to killing.